What is going on, everyone? My name is Andy. Welcome back to another FPL video. In this one, I'm going to answer some of your pre-season questions, such as is it worth booking in a transfer to do Isak to Watkins? When to wildcard? Is Jack Grealish an option? Plus plenty of other stuff as well. So if you enjoyed the video, make sure to give it a like and hit that subscribe button. And if you haven't checked out Fantasy Football Hub, they do have 50% off at the moment, which will get you access to all of their tools. And if you sign up and don't win your mini league, you can get your money back. Terms and conditions do apply for that. I'll leave all the links you need in the description below. Don't forget to check it out. So first question, what do you think about booking transfers this season? For example, Isak to Watkins in game week 3. And I've seen a few people talk about that move. One thing to keep in mind, they're different prices. So Isak is 8.5 and Watkins is 9. So if you want to make that transfer in one move, you're going to have to save 0.5 million in the bank and hope that no price changes occur. Otherwise, it's going to cost you 2 free transfers, and that's probably not worth it when we can save up to 5. Now, I want to make it clear, just because we can save up to 5 free transfers doesn't mean we should always be aiming to do that. But where possible, if you can make a better long-term pick and not have to use as many transfers, that's probably going to benefit you in the long term when all of a sudden issues start to crop up and there's really big fixture swings and stuff like that. So I don't mind this, but I'd really only want to do it in one move. The other thing to point out is, yes, Isak's first 2 fixtures are better, right? No one would argue that. It's Southampton at home and Bournemouth away. But it's not like Watkins has awful fixtures. Okay, playing Arsenal is not great, right? I get that. They're the best defence in the league. Maybe he is going to blank in that fixture. But West Ham away is okay. And if you think long-term he's the much better pick, I don't know, I'd almost rather start with him than just pre-book that transfer. I just think at the start of the season in particular, there's lots of information to gather from, players that might miss the first game week because of being in Euro 2024 and the Copa America. You might want to bring them in sooner rather than later. There's going to be some players that don't get as many minutes as you expected. There's going to be pre-season bandwagons. The transfer window's still going to be open. All that information to come. Is it really worth doing Isak to Watkins? Is that advantage enough to pre-book a transfer? I'm not convinced it is. And also, just to point this out for Isak, he doesn't suddenly become a terrible option from game week 3. Like Spurs at home, Wolves away, Fulham away, that's not that bad. And if he's absolutely smashed it in the first 2 game weeks, you won't want to sell him. So I understand it, right? Because Villa's fixtures from game week 3 onwards are great, and the first 2 are not that ideal. But I'm not sure it's worth booking a transfer. And the fact you have to save the 0.5 million is not really something that I would favour. Like, because of the way that FPL's done the pricing, it's quite hard to put together a good squad and save money as well. So for me, and maybe I've got this wrong, I would quite like Watkins from game week 3 onwards, but I'm just going to play it by ear. And if we get there and the team looks good and there's a couple of free transfers to use and you can't see yourself needing any more longer term, then fine, maybe you make that change. Or maybe it's you sell someone else. Maybe you start with Haaland, and after the Ipswich game, you want to downgrade him to Watkins and use that money on Salah in midfield or whatever it might be. That's another way to play it. But I'm not sure I'd pre-book this one. Lots of people are considering it, so I've probably got it wrong. But I'm not sure it's one for me. I think I'd rather just keep Isak a bit longer term. But overall, if we ignore this specific example between Isak and Watkins, I think pre-booking transfers is still okay. But I wouldn't do a huge amount at the start of the season. There's lots more information you're going to get as soon as game week 1 kicks off. So should we be planning already about when to wildcard? It seems like there is already a debate on when to do it, and people are building their teams depending on their wildcard window. So I'm probably going to contradict myself a little bit with the answer, but here goes. It can be really handy to know exactly when you're going to wildcard, because ultimately that lets you maximise the points in the game weeks leading up to it by targeting the fixtures. So to give you an example, let's say you were wildcarding in game week 4, you were dead set on that as your strategy. Well, you'd probably completely ignore Brighton players, for example. They've got Everton away, Man United at home and Arsenal away, first 3 game weeks of the season. Likewise with Arsenal, I've mentioned in my last few draft videos that I will probably, not guaranteed, but probably ignore Arsenal defenders because in game weeks 2, 4 and 5, they've got Villa away, Spurs away and Man City away. I don't think it's a high chance of getting clean sheets in those games. But if I was definitely wildcarding in game week 4, well, then you're looking at the first 3 fixtures for Arsenal, and it's Wolves at home, Villa away, and Brighton at home. And okay, you've still got that Villa game in there, But for the best defence in the league, having 2 home games against Wolves and Brighton, I probably want at least one of their defenders. And so that might change my strategy. So it can be important to know when you're going to wildcard. And I also think, because of the 5 transfer rule where you can bank up to 5 free transfers, using an early wildcard is probably more viable than it has been over the last few seasons. It doesn't mean you couldn't do it in previous seasons, but now you could target game week 4 as your wildcard window, roll the transfer for game weeks 2 and 3, overhaul your team and target the fixtures, knowing that you're going to come out with it with a couple of free transfers banked, and also be able to roll because you've just wildcarded, right? So I think an early wildcard is worth thinking about. Here's where the contradiction comes in. I probably won't plan when I'm going to wildcard because ultimately, I don't think I'd want to use it as early as game week 4 anyway. And if I'm going to start looking at game week 6, which is quite popular, the team I'm going to build for the first 5 game weeks is probably not going to change a huge amount anyway. Because with all that information we've still got to come, which I mentioned in the first question about, transfer windows, players that are going to play that we weren't expecting, or vice versa, I don't want to look too much longer term than game week 6. So the team that I build, without thinking about my wild card, is going to be focused on the first 5 fixtures. So if I get to game week 6 and I decide I need more Arsenal players, for example, well, I just decide on that then. Have I got the transfers just to get those Arsenal players in and the rest of the squad looks great? Yes, in which case just use the transfers. If I think, well, I need double or triple Arsenal now, and there's like 5 other players I could change, and I've got a couple of transfers spare, I'll probably just wildcard and then hold on to those transfers I had. So for me, it doesn't sound great when you've got an FPL channel and this is how you're going to play it, but I'm going to play it by ear. I'm going to wing it, basically. I'm going to look at the first 4 or 5 game weeks, build my team, and then decide when to wildcard later. I just think if I set in stone that I was going to wildcard in game week 6, my team wouldn't be that much different. I think, yes, it could be if it was wildcard 4, but I don't know if I want to plan that early. Because ultimately, I think there's a lot of players with good fixtures for the first 5-6 game weeks anyway. There's only certain teams like Arsenal, who I've mentioned a lot now, where maybe I'm going to need a few more of those players later. So it's worth thinking about, absolutely. But I don't think you have to go into game week 1 knowing exactly when you're going to wildcard. It's okay to take in more information over the first few weeks and then decide what to do later. At least that's probably what I'm going to do. So how do you like Grealish as a bonus point monster for 6.5 million in a wildcard 4 draft? So ultimately they're looking to wildcard in game week 4 and they're only looking at the first 3 game weeks when building their squad right now. Especially with Pep saying that players who played during the summer won't be back to start the season. Now Grealish is an interesting one. I do think that he will start the season in that first 11 for Man City. How long will that last for is anyone's guess, right? We know that Pep is happy to change things around. But I think he will definitely favour the fact that Grealish has been available for the whole pre-season. He's building up his minutes and he's fresher than a lot of other players. So I think he will start against Chelsea away in game week 1. And as long as it's not a terrible performance, he'll probably start against Ipswich at home in game week 2. And then a week later, you've got West Ham away in game week 3. I think there's a good chance that Grealish starts all of those games. But as a longer term pick, because a few people have asked me about him in general, right? Not with the wild card in mind. I'd just be too worried about Pep mixing things up or Grealish getting subbed early or something like that. I think he's potentially really good value for 6.5, but there's a lot of players at that price point that also fit under that potential value bracket, and some of them have got more guaranteed minutes than Grealish will have. So I think on a wildcard 4 strategy, you could definitely look at him. In terms of Pep saying players who played during the summer won't be back to start the season, I think he said that they will get reintegrated into the team against Chelsea and Ipswich, which are basically game weeks 1 and 2. So there is a chance that the likes of Foden, Rodri, etc. won't start in game week 1. But it is quite a tough fixture against Chelsea away. I wouldn't be completely surprised if 1 or 2 of them do start. And the thing is, it's not going to take long for Foden, who was a mainstay in the team last year, and Rodri, who basically plays every game he's available for, to be back in that 11, right? And it could be that that happens in game week 2 against Ipswich. Let's say they don't start against Chelsea. They could come off the bench and then they could be ready for game week 2. And who's to say that, Foden doesn't play on the left and Bernardo Silva's on the right. It's Haaland through the middle. You got De Bruyne behind him and Foden's not playing central. Right? It could happen and it might not. I think it's more likely that Grealish will start. But this is always the problem with Man City players. The long term, you're just not sure exactly what Pep's going to do. So I think right now, if I had to guess, Grealish will start the first 2 game weeks, probably the third one as well. I think after the international break, it's anyone's guess from game weeks 4 onwards. So if you're guaranteeing that you're going to wildcard in game week 4, I like him as a bit of a punt. But anyone who's not setting in stone when they're going to use their wildcard, I just think there's probably better long-term players you can go for 6.5. But don't get me wrong, that Ipswich at home game, being able to get a Man City attacker for that, I get why people want to do it, right? I get the incentive of picking someone like Grealish. I just think that if you're not on an early wild card, he's probably going to be a transfer you're going to have to make sooner rather than later. And in that case, I think I'd rather go for a different 6.5 and maybe bank that transfer if possible. It depends how you want to play it. I think as a short-term aggressive punt, Grealish is pretty good. But let's get more information in the Community Shield, how many minutes the players get there, and then who looks likely to be available for Chelsea in game week 1. So is Saka worth it when you have options like Odegaard, who has had a full pre-season, and Havertz, who plays as a striker? So there's a few things to talk about. Let's start with why I like Saka so much. So if I just go to the stats on Fantasy Football Hub and bring up his numbers from last year, he ran at 0.32 non-penalty expected goals per 90 and 0.33 expected assists. So pretty decent numbers. And obviously he consistently plays, consistently gets good minutes, and he's got penalties on top of that. Every now and again he has given some penalties away, but he's going to take the bulk of them. If we look at Odegaard as a comparison, his expected assists are similar at 0.3, although slightly less, and then his non-penalty expected goals 0.17. So his goal threat is not as high, and he doesn't have penalties. So I think for that reason alone, Saka is worth the extra 1.5 if you've got the money to spare. And then with Havertz, who's obviously been moved to a forward this year, his numbers are 0.39 non-penalty expected goals per 90, slightly higher, as I discussed on another video, when he plays as the number 9. So his goal threat is higher, but he's not as creative. His minutes probably aren't quite so good. I think for what it's worth, he'll be in the 11 the majority of the time, but whether he's guaranteed to always be the number 9, I think there's a little bit of a question mark on that. And obviously he doesn't have penalties. So that's why I like Saka. In terms of an option from game week 1, Euro 2024 might play a part in Saka's availability. I think after the last Euros, he was benched in game week 1. We do need to not over-exaggerate how much game time these players are going to miss. If Saka is benched in game week 1, I suspect he'll be in the team from game week 2 onwards, as long as he's fit and available, right? Because Arteta always plays him. We need to wait for more information. If we get closer to game week 1 and Arteta puts doubts in my mind about whether Saka's going to start, I won't go for him. And in that case, you could just go for Odegaard and Havertz instead. But I think in isolation, Saka is the better option. But it's always going to come down to combinations as well. So for example, if you've got Saka and a 4.5 million defender, you could have Odegaard and a premium defender, right? So instead of Saka and Lewis Dunk, as an example, you could have Odegaard and Saliba. Maybe that combination is better. So I think it all depends on how you've set your squad up. The last draft that I did had Saka in it, and personally I don't think there was a huge amount of sacrifices to get there, at least not ones that I wasn't happy with. And I would prefer him to Odegaard, but it doesn't make Odegaard or Havertz bad picks, right? They're better value, you could say, because they're less money. And obviously Odegaard has been available throughout the summer, so there's no issues about fitness and stuff like that. But I think the idea that Saka got a lot of minutes during the Euros and therefore he's going to get limited minutes early on, I'm not sure that's necessarily going to be the case. But also, if you do think that's possible, then yeah, he's worth ignoring completely and just looking elsewhere. You could go for Son, who's had a lot of pre-season minutes, Palmer, who played less obviously for England. There's loads of ways you could go it. So my main takeaway would be, when they're all fully fit and available, I think Saka is the best option, right? You can debate about whether he's worth paying 10 million more, but I think he will get more points than the other two. I think for game week 1, if you wanted to play it a bit safer, you could definitely go without him. So is Anthony Gordon a better FPL pick if he signs for Liverpool than he would be for Newcastle? Now, for what it's worth, I don't expect this transfer to go through, but a couple of people have asked me about it, so I'm going to quickly answer it now, and then if he does sign later on, we can come back onto it in more detail maybe. I think it's more likely he becomes a worse pick than a better one, because although he's going into Liverpool, a better team that you would expect to score more goals than Newcastle, which could mean his individual numbers go up in terms of creativity and goal threat, his minutes will come down, right? They've got Gakpo, Diaz and Jota that can all play on the left, and I'm sure if they sign Anthony Gordon, one of those players at least will go. but there is still a worry about rotation. And until we know more about exactly who's going to play in that Liverpool attack, which we're actually coming on to in a minute, there would just be too much uncertainty at the start of the season. The thing you have at Newcastle is a player with good numbers in a team that's still fairly attacking, but you know he's always going to start. And that's such a key for FPL. There's so many players in the league that could be great FPL picks if they had the minutes. But minutes is a huge consideration, right? And Liverpool is a big problem because they got so many attackers. It might be that if they sign Gordon, he becomes first choice left wing, always starts, always gets 75 minutes plus, and maybe he becomes a slightly better option. But I don't think it would be massively. I'm not convinced his individual numbers would go up in a way where he'd be better than he would be at Newcastle. That's my quick thoughts. Let's wait to see if he signs. So this is a good follow-on question. Is the Liverpool attack massively overlooked? 7.5 million for a Liverpool attacker with those fixtures could be a steal. I reckon Gakpo will be good, and also Jota, since he's the only one back early for pre-season with Salah. Now this is nice and simple for me. If you can tell me which Liverpool attacker outside of Salah is nailed for the first 5 game weeks, I'll probably put them straight into my FPL squad and just leave them there for game week 1. Because I think Diaz, Gakpo, Jota and Darwin, especially the latter two in particular, could be great value. The problem is, if you can't tell me which of those players is nailed, that is why they're being overlooked, right? Because minutes play a huge part in building your FPL squad. I know people say things like, well, even if they don't start, they can get something off the bench. And that's literally true. But ultimately, you want players that start, right? And I think there's a problem longer term. Right now, at the time of recording, Jota is back. I expect him to play number 9 in their friendlies. And it's possible that he does start the season. The thing that worries me with going for riskier picks like this is when the international break is. Because again, like I said with Saka for Arsenal, being away for the summer is not going to keep players out for weeks. Okay, they might not start game week 1, maybe not game week 2, but after that they're probably going to be fine. And even if they're not, after the international break they definitely will be, as long as they haven't picked up an injury or something like that. And the international break is after game week 3. So even if Jota gets a couple of pre-season games before Darwin is back as the number 9, you know, he might get the first 3 games, Ipswich away, Brentford at home and United away, and maybe that's enough for a differential punt. But from game week 4 onwards, could you be as confident? Especially under a new manager, we're not quite sure how he wants to set up, or more importantly, which personnel he wants to play play in that setup. I just think there's a little bit too much risk there. Now, come back to me in a week or two, and if Darwin's picked up an injury and Jota looks to be the main number 9 and Gakpo's mostly being used off the left, then I'm massively interested in Jota. Or let's say Gakpo's not favoured and Diaz is going to start, I'd be interested in him too. But there's just too much uncertainty right now, longer term. And the international break really does put me off some of these picks, because I feel like even if they miss the first 3, or they're not fully fit for the first 3, they will be after that, and players will come back in. And then you've suddenly got a lot of options that can play in limited spaces. And also with Gakpo, I think a lot of the reason people think he could be good, and he might be, right? I don't know is the honest answer, is because he's Dutch and so is Slot, and that he played well during Euro 2024. Obviously, we've seen spells at Liverpool where he's done well too, but I'm not sure there's been a huge amount of consistency. So, I don't know, maybe it's going to be Gakpo left, Jota or Darwin through the middle and Salah on the right. Maybe Diaz will get a lot of minutes. I just don't know, and that's why they're being massively overlooked. If you reckon Gakpo will be good and he's going to start regularly, I would definitely consider him. But if you're not sure, I think you've probably just got to leave them out. So Kulusevski played his second pre-season game as the number 9 for Spurs, getting a goal and assist. Does he become a rogue differential option? I think the answer is maybe, but I just don't see it. Like, I've not watched, if I'm honest, Spurs pre-season games. I know that Spurs fans are saying that he's played well. I've seen some of the clips too, and I get that. And I think the way that he would play number 9 would be different to a traditional number 9, in that he would bring the likes of Son and Johnson into play a bit more, and maybe that could work. But when I'm looking ahead to like game week 7, 8, 9, 10, further on in the season, can I still picture Kulusevski being Spurs' main number 9 and getting regular minutes? I just think there's way too much of a risk there. You've also got to bear in mind, Son and Brennan Johnson can both play through the middle, and Richarlison's obviously been out with an injury. So when he gets back fit, he's another option. And a lot of the time last season when he was available, Richarlison played as that number 9. So there's just too much competition there. And again, I know I've been banging on about it quite a lot, but that international break, even if Richarlison wasn't fit to start the season, You look at Spurs fixtures, game week 4 isn't until the 15th of September. You've still got a month and a half to get fit for that. There's just no guarantee Kulusevski would keep starting in that role. And even if he did, you wouldn't really know what the minutes would be. It might be that he would be subbed off. For what it's worth, I think he is better for Spurs central rather than as a wide player, especially under Postecoglou. I think the likes of Johnson and Son fit better. But it doesn't even mean that if he wasn't playing 9, he would play 10, because obviously you've got Maddison there as well. So he's not one for me. I prefer... it's not that I'm against going for someone a little bit different, right? I don't really look at ownership when I'm putting my squad together. I might do it for video purposes, but it doesn't really bother me if someone's low owned or high owned. I'd rather go for someone I know is going to still be getting minutes in kind of 4 or 5 game weeks time. And also, by the way, again, looking at the stats for last season on Hub, if I go to Kulusevski, like 0.16 non-penalty expected goals, 0.21 expected assists. There's defenders with better numbers than that. And I know he's 6.5 and the numbers would probably improve if he's playing number 9. There's just no guarantee of it. Look, by the time you watch this video, if you don't watch it the day it goes out, it might be that someone else is playing number 9 in the next friendly. So, I don't know. If he plays all of pre-season as the 9 and Postecoglou is very positive about it, I could maybe see him as a short-term differential option if that's the way you want to play. And I definitely don't want to put people off buying players. Right? I've got a set way of playing. I do like to go for more safer picks in terms of minutes. It doesn't mean you have to do the same. You might only have your mini league in mind. You might just want to play aggressive and not really care about your overall rank. That's absolutely fine, right? Kulusevski could be a differential. Long-term one, definitely don't see it. Can you please talk about how to gain money? My highest squad value last season was 101.8 million, but lots of people had 105 million or more. Now, part of this is just going to be luck. If I pick a squad for game week 1 that absolutely smashes it, not only am I ahead on points, but other FPL managers will start buying the players that I own because they've done well, and therefore they'll go up in price. Likewise, I could build a squad that does terribly, people start selling those players, and then I lose team value. So there is a little bit of luck. For example, last year I went for Mbermo, I think it was, in game week 1, and he did really well straight away, so he started going up in price. We can spend a lot of time talking about who the best players are, and hopefully we will nail down some of them, but nobody makes perfect decisions all season, right? So you've got to hope that your initial picks do well, because there's a lot of active managers at the start of the season that will bring those players in. During the season, once it actually starts, you can check which players are likely to go up and down in price once the game weeks have started. So Fantasy Football Hub do have a price change page, which is free. I can't show you it right now because the season hasn't started, but it will give you an idea about who's going to go up in price. So if you've got a player that hasn't done well and they look like they're about to drop, and you know exactly who you want to bring in instead, you can maybe make that transfer early. Now, I'm going to get lots of questions throughout the season about whether to move early on players. So we will discuss this again. But ultimately, I think the start of the season is a better time to do it than when European matches and cup matches start. Because if someone plays game week 1 and you want to change to someone else for game week 2, the only real time they can get injured is during training, which can happen, but it's not that likely. Whereas when a player's got to go and play a Champions League game midweek, there's more chance of picking up an injury. So if you're going to move early for price rises, the start of the season is probably the time to do it. I do prefer to wait as long as possible because stuff can go wrong. Like wait till Friday when you've heard the press conferences. But I have moved early before. I think it was last season. I did Chilwell to Trippier, I believe. And I did that on a Sunday evening. The next game week wasn't until Friday or Saturday. So that's another way you can make money, is to make transfers before the players you own drop in price and before the players you want to buy go up in price. But we'll come on to that again when the season actually started. The other thing to keep an eye on, which is going to be a bit more minor, is who the high-owned players are. Because if you've got a high-owned player for game week 1 that doesn't do well straight away, people will start selling them and they'll go down in price. So if we have a quick look at the ownership, one player to really keep an eye... Actually, he's the highest owned goalkeeper right now, and that is Matt Turner at Nottingham Forest. Now, I've had him in some of my drafts just because I randomly put a 4 million goalkeeper in. He's not going to play. He's actually probably third choice goalkeeper at Nottingham Forest now, behind Sells and Miguel. So if you put him in, when people realise he's not going to play and they start making changes, he will drop in price to 3.9. Right now, I wouldn't guarantee it, but I think it's a good chance that Matt Turner's the first goalkeeper to drop in price. So unless he's going to start playing all of a sudden, I would just pick a much lower owned 4 million keeper. And you can literally just go to goalkeepers down to 4 million. There's loads at like 0.2% ownership. They're gonna drop in price a lot slower. So that's just minor things you can look at as well. I don't think there's too many high owned players that I would like. Darren Burn, for example, is 23.1%. If he's not first choice, right, and he gets benched in game weeks 1 or 2, he will quickly drop in price. Personally, I'm not sure it's a huge issue because I think he is a favourite of Eddie Howe, as I've said before, and I think he will start. But if there's doubts around that, I would ignore him. So you've got to be careful with high-owned players because if they don't do well, people will start selling them and they will drop in price. Like, it doesn't mean you should... it doesn't mean that you should completely ignore anyone that's high-owned, right? Like, Saliba's 41.1%. He's absolutely nailed on. Arsenal defence is great. He'll probably be fine in terms of holding his price. But if they don't keep a clean sheet in one of the first home games and they lose the clean sheet in all of the away ones, he'll start getting sold and drop in price. Now, for Saliba, that wouldn't put me off buying him because I think he is just a good option. But players like Turner and Dan Burn, I'd be a bit more careful of. It's the same with, let me just bring up the forwards for 4.5. I would suggest that Stuart's only 1.7% owned, so he's probably fine. The highest owned is Fraser from Wolves at 5%. So I'm not sure there's a huge issue with the forwards, but that's generally what I would think about. Don't go for super high-owned players that you know are just not going to play because they will get sold and drop in price. And once the season starts, you can start checking out the price changes. Otherwise, there's just a bit of luck involved. So a couple of slightly different questions here. Would you go for Haaland knowing that he would only score once against Ipswich, so a 6 or 7 pointer, or would you need more from him? Now, with Haaland, he's obviously capable of getting big scores against anyone, so Ipswich is not the only reason to own him. But for the start of the season, it is a big part of why he's currently in my squad. So if he only gets a 6 or 7 pointer, and I knew that information beforehand, I would take him out. Because I would expect Salah to be able to get a 6 or 7 pointer against Brentford at home in game week 2, so I wouldn't need to worry about captaining Haaland. And obviously Salah has Ipswich in game week 1 as well, and there'd be more money to spread around the rest of the squad. So as much as he could absolutely smash it in every other game and get a 6 or 7 pointer against Ipswich, if I knew that information, I'd probably take him out of the draft. And then the second question, if you could know only one piece of information about the first 3 game weeks, what would it be? Now, my initial instinct was, what has Haaland scored or what has Salah scored? Right? Because if I know one of those bits of information, I can probably make a decision about which one of the two to go for. So if you told me that Salah only gets 10 points, I'd definitely go for Haaland, right? Or vice versa. If I asked how many points Haaland's got and it's 20, I mean, that could be, 7-7-6, so not a huge score in any of the games. So maybe I would go elsewhere, but 20 would probably be enough. So I think that's the key bit of information. When I thought about this a little bit more, maybe it would be better to ask a broader question like, who's the highest scoring midfielder of the first 3 game weeks? Because if it's not Salah and it's someone random, like, I don't know, Nkunku, Eze, or Cole Palmer or Son, then first of all, I know Salah hasn't scored that many points, or at least hasn't scored as much as they have, because otherwise he would be the highest scorer. Plus, I know what the bandwagon's going to be, so that's money to be made as well. And of course, I've got a lot of points, and that could probably help my decision about whether to go for Haaland. So I'm not sure. I think it's better to ask a question like that, right? Who is the highest scoring midfielder over the first 3 game weeks? There's smarter people out there have probably got a much better question to ask, but I think that's it. I would ask who scored the most points out of midfielders, because if it's Salah, I probably want him in, depending on how many he's got. And if not, I go for a different bandwagon. Let me know what question you would ask in the comments below. If you enjoyed that video, give it a like, hit that subscribe button, rate 5 stars if you listen on podcast, and don't forget to check out Fantasy Football Hub, 50% off at the moment. Links in the description below. I will catch you again tomorrow.